I stood at the edge of the garden patio, holding the small, gold-wrapped box in both hands. It wasn't large, just enough to hold the antique brooch I'd had polished for the occasion. A delicate filigree piece my mother gave me when I turned 40. I thought maybe my daughter-in-law would like it, or perhaps she'd give it to the baby when she grew older. Something old, something from the family, something with meaning. But as I stepped forward, heart fluttering just a little, I heard my son's voice before he even turned to see me. Sharp, clear, "Mom, this part is just for real family." He motioned behind him to the table where they were gathering for photos and passing around champagne flutes. His words weren't loud, but they split the warm summer air like glass breaking. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask what he meant, or remind him that I was the one who carried him through a difficult labor, alone in a hospital lit by flickering ceiling bulbs and distant voices. I didn't tell him that my name was still the emergency contact on every school form until he was 22. I just held the box a little tighter, nodded as if I'd misunderstood, and walked to the far corner of the yard, where the string lights didn't quite reach. I'm Elaine Morris, I'm 71, and that was the moment I knew my place had been quietly erased. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks, it wasn't sudden. Not really, if I'm honest with myself. And at this age, there's little point in being anything but honest. The signs had been creeping in for years. But that moment, at the party I had helped pay for, when I was told with a smile that it was just for real family, something in me gave way. I remember the chair I sat in afterward, wicker, with a cushion that didn't quite match. It was positioned near the back fence, under a tree whose name I never knew, but whose shade I appreciated all the same. I watched them laugh, pass drinks, pose for pictures with the baby and the cake. My gift sat on my lap, untouched, the wrapping starting to crease in the heat. No one looked for me, not even once. I stayed another 20 minutes, long enough to pretend I'd just needed air. Then I left the gift on a side table near the kitchen. No note, no fuss, and I slipped out the front gate without a goodbye. I remember the feeling in my throat, like something had lodged there and wouldn't move. Like trying to swallow sorrow made of stone. I walked 3 blocks before I called a taxi. I didn't want to ask anyone for a ride, not after that. The driver was young, probably my grandson's age, and he kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror like he was wondering if I'd been stood up. I almost wanted to tell him, just so someone in the world would know, but I didn't. I looked out the window instead. The city lights blurred past, and somewhere in the silence between stoplights, I started to cry, quietly, like a faucet left on somewhere in the distance. It wasn't that I needed to be the center of attention. I never have. I've always been the one setting tables, arranging chairs, staying late to do the dishes while others took the credit. But to be excluded like that, not by accident, but deliberately, as if I no longer belonged, as if I was something to manage rather than someone to include. It was a grief I didn't have words for. When I got home, the porch light was still on. I'd left it like that, half hoping maybe someone would stop by after. Maybe they'd notice I had left early. Maybe they'd think to check on me. I made tea even though it was too late for caffeine. I didn't drink it. I just held the mug and sat in the armchair by the front window. The television was off. The clock ticked. And somewhere deep in my chest, the ache settled in. It wasn't the first time they'd made me feel invisible, but it was the first time I truly believed them. I thought of all the birthdays I'd remembered, the meals I'd packed and frozen when my daughter-in-law gave birth, the nights I'd stayed on the phone with my son when his business was struggling, my voice hoarse by morning. I thought of how many times I'd bit my tongue, swallowed opinions, smiled through disappointments. I had done everything a mother is supposed to do, and then some. But standing in that yard, gift in hand, being told with a gentle nudge that I wasn't real family, something inside me quietly shifted. Not into rage, not even into heartbreak, just something like truth. There is a moment, I think, when a woman realizes she has been holding onto a rope that's already been cut from the other end. You feel the weight of it suddenly, the futility. You ask yourself how long you've been gripping it alone. That night, I set the mug down, I folded the cardigan I'd worn, I turned off the porch light, and I stood in the hallway for a long while. Looking at the photos on the wall, graduation, birthdays, beach days from 20 years ago, smiles caught in time, before the air between us grew thin, before they decided I was a shadow in their story, rather than part of the plot. I didn't sleep much. I listened to the wind, moving past the window, to the creak of the floorboard outside my bedroom, the one I always meant to fix. I lay there, not in anger, not in self-pity, but in something else. Something like quiet understanding. They had let me go, and I was finally beginning to see it. I used to think that being needed was the same as being loved. Maybe that's a mistake a lot of mothers make, confusing the endless list of things we do for our children with the idea that they'll remember, or even notice, when the time comes. I suppose I made a whole life out of giving, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask myself if I was ever truly seen, or if I was just convenient. Back when my son, Michael, was little, I had this habit of leaving handwritten notes in his lunchbox, silly ones at first, just hearts and smiley faces. Then little jokes, then words of encouragement on test days. I'd wake up at 5 every morning, not because I had to, but because I wanted his day to start with something warm, something that whispered, "You're not alone." When he caught the flu in 4th grade and couldn't keep anything down, I stayed up 3 nights in a row, holding a cold cloth to his forehead, counting minutes between fevers, listening to his shallow breaths and praying he wouldn't need. The hospital, I still remember the blue pajamas he wore, the ones with the tiny spaceships. I kept them in a box for years after he outgrew them, even though the elastic had worn thin. Then came the teenage years, the distance, the silence. That crept in like fog. But I stayed close, orbiting quietly. I made sure he never ran out of shampoo. I filled the car with gas when I borrowed it. I sent money for field trips without being asked. When he got into university, I cried the whole ride home after dropping him off, not because I was sad. Well, not entirely, but because I was proud. I had worked double shifts for almost 6 years to make sure he could go. I cleaned offices at night, took on private housekeeping jobs during the day, and learned to stretch every dollar. I skipped new shoes for 3 winters in a row. Wore the same coat for 5. When the fridge broke, I fixed it myself with YouTube tutorials and stubbornness. None of it ever felt like sacrifice. It felt like love. Later, when he married Rachel, I tried to make myself small enough to fit into whatever corner they'd allow me. I never gave opinions, even when I had them. I brought over meals and left before they asked. I babysat when they were busy, even if my knees ached and the baby was colicky. I never asked for a thank you. I just kept showing up. One winter, when their boiler gave out, I paid the bill quietly and told them it was some rebate check I'd received. I didn't want them to feel embarrassed. I just didn't want them cold. When Rachel's father had surgery, I brought soup and a casserole, even though she had once told me I was too old-fashioned in the kitchen. I suppose that's what people mean when they say women are the keepers of the hearth. We carry the warmth. We learn to patch the cracks in silence. We become the soft cushion the family lands on, until one day they forget the cushion is there, and maybe that's the thing that hurts most. Not that they forgot the big things, though they did, but that they forgot the 1,000 small ones, the hours in waiting rooms, the phone calls to doctors, the handwritten grocery lists when Rachel had gestational diabetes, the time I stayed up folding their laundry when they both came down with the flu. There's a photo somewhere in my bottom drawer of Michael on his 6th birthday. His hair is still damp from the bath. And he's standing in front of a cake I baked, lopsided, but full of strawberries and hope. He's grinning so wide you'd think nothing in the world could ever come between us. I used to pull that photo out when things started to feel too far gone between us. Like a bookmark in a story I didn't want to end, but lately I haven't looked at it, not because I've stopped loving him, I don't think that's possible, but because I've started to wonder if I ever really knew who he was. Or if I only ever saw the version I wanted to believe in. There were times, too, when I let parts of myself go so they could have more. I used to paint, watercolors mostly. I wasn't great, but it made me feel quiet inside. I gave it up when Michael turned 9 and we couldn't afford the art supplies and football shoes. I never picked it back up. I had friends once. A few women I'd meet at the community centre for coffee and gentle gossip, but as the years wore on and my schedule filled with their emergencies, birthdays, play rehearsals, and dentist appointments, the calls grew less frequent, the invitations stopped. And I never reached back out. I told myself it was worth it, that motherhood was my calling, that invisibility was just part of the job. But standing alone at that party, the gold-wrapped brooch in my hand, I saw my reflection in the kitchen window, small, forgotten, and trying to shrink further, and I felt the full weight of everything I had given, and how little of it had stayed. I don't say this with bitterness, truly, I don't. I say it with a kind of tired clarity. Like waking up and realizing the dream you've been having was more illusion than memory. When you give everything to a home, you expect it to remember your hands, your voice, the way you kept it stitched together in lean seasons, but sometimes they repaint the walls, change the locks, and act like the foundation laid itself. I still remember the feel of Michael's forehead pressed to mine when he had nightmares as a boy. I remember the softness in his voice when he used to call me Mama, as if I were the only safe place in the world. I remember believing, deeply, that bond would carry us through anything. But time does strange things to people, and the world has a way of whispering that mothers are meant to be background, silent, supportive, and out of the way. I used to do everything for them, and for the longest time I thought it meant something unshakable, unbreakable. Now I'm learning that even love, if not held carefully, can be forgotten. And when it is, the silence that follows is louder than anything I've ever heard. It's not always the big betrayals that break you. Sometimes it's the accumulation of little cuts, small, sharp moments that don't bleed right away. You feel them later, when you're alone, brushing your teeth or folding socks, and the sting comes quietly. You remember the tone more than the words, the glance more than the gesture. I started noticing the distance long before the party, not in obvious ways. Michael still called. Sometimes Rachel would text, especially when they needed something. But there was a quiet erosion, a pulling away so slow, so careful. It could almost pass for normal. It began with the pauses. The way Michael would say, "We're trying to keep things simple this year, around Christmas." The way Rachel would say, "Let's just keep it to us three," when planning birthday dinners for the baby. US 3, I was always nearby, always. Smiling, always offering to bring the cake or take the photos. But more and more, I became the extra plate, the background fixture, the person who came early to help set the table, and left before the candles were blown out. I don't think they even noticed. One year, they didn't call on my birthday, not even a message. I tried to tell myself they were busy, that life with a toddler was hectic. That time slips away from people, but by dinner time I'd set a place for myself at the table, lit a candle, and sat in silence. No calls, no knock at the door, no reason. That was the first year I didn't bake myself a cake. Then there was the afternoon Rachel dropped off Lily, my granddaughter, for a last-minute babysit. She didn't come in, just handed me the diaper bag at the door and said, "She's just eaten. So she shouldn't need much. No kiss. No thank you, just a glance at her phone and back down the steps. Lily clung to me all day, her curls tangled, her socks mismatched. She asked for juice. And I realized the bag had nothing in it but a soiled onesie and one half-eaten teething biscuit, so I made her soup, sat her on the quilt I'd sewn years ago, and played nursery rhymes on my phone. She giggled and patted my face with her tiny hand, and when Rachel came back 5 hours later, she barely looked at me, just scooped Lily up and said, "We'll let you know next time." There was never a next time. That's how it always went. Quiet needs, quiet disappearances, quiet thanklessness. When I got sick last winter, just the flu, but it hit hard, I called Michael. My hands were shaking, and I felt lightheaded. I didn't want much, just someone to know I wasn't well. He said he'd check in, said he might stop by after work, but he never did. Days passed. I recovered slowly, alone, heating canned soup and watching snow fall through the kitchen window, each flake landing like a question. I stopped asking for help after that. The 100 small hurts are hard to explain to anyone else. If I tried to tell a friend, they'd say, "But at least you still hear from him." Or at least he's not angry, but it's not the absence of rage that hurts, it's the absence of care, the absence of wondering, the absence of being seen at all. There were holidays where I'd walk into their house with arms full of wrapped gifts, only to realize they'd already opened presents without me. "We thought you might be late," they'd say, smiling. Not unkind, just thoughtless, like a guest, not a mother, like someone they were mildly surprised to see. I tried, more than once, to explain how it felt, not directly, just little hints. I'd say, "It's quiet at my place," or "I miss having company on weekends," but the words never landed. Rachel would nod, distracted. Michael would change the subject. Sometimes I wondered if they even registered that I had spoken. There was a Thanksgiving when I offered to bring the pie. I made it from scratch, my mother's recipe, with hand-rolled crust and cinnamon just the way Michael liked as a boy. When I arrived, Rachel said, "Oh, we already picked one up from the bakery." She placed mine on the edge of the counter. Untouched, I took it home that evening. Still warm, I threw it away the next morning. Even at church, people began to ask less about my family. I used to beam when someone mentioned Michael. I had photos in my wallet, proud stories ready. But slowly, the stories dried up. I had fewer updates. I knew less and less. Eventually, I stopped bringing the pictures. It's strange, the way you can vanish from your own life, one spring. I sent Rachel a card for Mother's Day, just a simple one, with a thoughtful message. She never mentioned it. When Michael called the following week, I asked if she'd received it. He paused, said something about it probably being somewhere in the pile. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being forgotten, I was being shelved, set aside like an old book. Too familiar to reread, too inconvenient to toss. I began to shrink myself on purpose. I stopped calling first. I didn't offer help unless asked. IRSVPD maybe instead of yes. I waited to see if they'd notice. They didn't, and somewhere in the quiet between those moments, the ache hardened, not into anger, not into resentment. Just something still, like a frost that won't melt. I told myself I was imagining it, that they were just busy, overwhelmed, preoccupied with careers and diapers and mortgage payments. But then the party happened, the moment with the gift, the words, "just for real family," and it all snapped into place. Every missed call, every unopened card, every pie left uneaten. It hadn't been coincidence, it had been a slow, quiet rewriting of the story, one where I was no longer needed, or worse, no longer wanted. Now, when I walk past my hallway mirror, I sometimes pause, not to fix my hair or adjust my collar, but to study the face staring back. There are lines there I don't remember earning. A tiredness in the eyes that speaks of rooms to quiet, of birthdays to silent, but also, maybe, a kind of clarity, the kind that only comes after enough small wounds to finally feel their shape. I didn't stop loving them, but I have started understanding how easily love can become a monologue when you whisper to yourself, hoping someone on the other end is still listening, even when the line has already gone dead. It was the kind of envelope that doesn't look like much, white, slightly crumpled, with my name printed in a font that felt more mechanical than personal. I almost didn't open it. I thought it was another bank promotion, or maybe a medical reminder, but inside was a formal letter from a law firm, crisp, cold, and distant. The sort of letter that doesn't tell a story but signals that one has already been written, without you. It was the first time I learned the house was no longer in my name, the house I was still living in, the house I had paid off slowly, month by month. Over 3 decades, the one with the handprints in the cement path that Michael made when he was 5, his fingers forever caught in a moment of laughter and wet cement. The house with the creaky floorboard near the kitchen I never fixed because it reminded me of how he'd sneak in for cookies after bedtime. I read the letter 3 times, thinking surely there had been a mistake, but no, it was all correct. Legally binding, clear, my son had used a power of attorney, one I had signed years ago, back when I had my gallbladder removed and the doctor suggested putting safeguards in place just in case. Back then, Michael had sat beside my hospital bed and told me it was for emergencies only. Just paperwork. Mom, he had said, squeezing my hand. I believed him. I never imagined he'd use it to take the deed out of my name while I was still alive, still walking those rooms, still paying the property taxes, quietly, without a word, without a warning. It had happened 8 months before I even found out. At first, I couldn't breathe. I stood in the hallway, letter in hand, staring at the photos on the wall like they could explain it. One of them, a faded picture of Michael at his high school graduation, hung slightly crooked. I reached out to straighten it, and my hand trembled. I thought maybe there was some logical reason. Some financial maneuver, maybe they were trying to protect the property from taxes, from some legal technicality I didn't understand, so I called him. He didn't answer. I left a message, calm, polite. I said I'd received something strange in the mail and just wanted to check if he knew about it. He never called back. 2 days later, Rachel sent a text. It's just a legal thing, she wrote. Michael thought it would be easier this way. Nothing changes for you. But everything had already changed. It wasn't about ownership. Not really. It was about being removed from the center of your own life. About having something taken from you. Not in anger, not even in haste, but in quiet disregard, as if your name no longer mattered, as if your presence didn't require acknowledgement. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table and ran my fingers along the edge of the letter again. Then I opened the drawer next to the stove and pulled out the manila envelope I kept for important papers. Inside was the copy of the original deed, the one with my name, signed and notarized. I placed it side by side with the new version, and I stared at the absence of my name like it was a wound. The house had been my anchor for so long. When my husband left, years ago, without warning or apology, this place became my sanctuary. I painted the walls myself. I planted the rose bushes out front, pruning them every spring. I hosted baby showers, book clubs, and quiet Sunday dinners here. This home had absorbed my joy, my grief, my hope, and now it belonged to someone else. Legally, secretly, I thought about the way Michael had started referring to the house in recent months. Your place, he'd say. Not the house, not home, just something slightly distant, slightly cold. I hadn't noticed the shift at the time, but now it echoed. I made tea that afternoon and sat with the silence. The kettle whistled. The light shifted across the floor. The world didn't end, but something inside me did, and the worst part, they didn't even think I'd care. That realization hurt more than the document itself. That they had done it thinking I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I wouldn't mind. That I'd nod politely, maybe even thank them, as if I had no agency, no dignity, no reason to be consulted. It wasn't betrayal with malice. That might have been easier to swallow. It was betrayal wrapped in indifference. Days passed, I didn't reach out again. I didn't ask for explanations. I stopped waiting for one. I walked the house slowly each evening, touched the door frames, traced the corners of the windows. Stood in the room where Michael once made pillow forts and pretended he was an explorer, and I wondered how something so sacred could be signed away like a subscription, with a pen stroke, with a stamp. The garden, too, began to feel like borrowed land. I still watered the flowers, but something in the way the soil felt under my fingers had changed. It no longer yielded to me with familiarity. It had become as strange as earth. One night, I stood in the hallway, barefoot, looking at my reflection in the narrow mirror near the coat rack. I looked older than I remembered, tired in a way I couldn't quite place. But not broken, not yet. There's a difference, I think, between being hurt and being erased. This was erasure. They had taken my name off the deed, but more than that, they had quietly removed me from the narrative of my own life. They had rewritten the story without telling the main character, and so I began to retreat, not out of spite, but out of necessity. There was no confrontation, no shouting match, no slammed doors. Just a quiet, deliberate withdrawal. One evening, I took down the photos from the hallway walls and wrapped them in soft cloth. I placed them in a storage bin in the guest room closet. I wasn't ready to throw them away, but I didn't want to see them every day, either, not right now. I began sleeping with the bedroom door slightly open again, the way I used to before. The house started feeling so hollow, and I left a small lamp on in the living room. I don't know why, maybe to remind myself that I still belonged here, even if the paperwork said otherwise. But deep down, I knew something had shifted in me. Not a flicker, not a flare. A permanent change, a resolve. They had crossed the final line, and now, without saying a word, I was drawing one of my own after that letter, after I stood there and watched my own name vanish from the place I still swept, still slept in, still called home. I stopped trying to explain myself to anyone. There's a kind of silence that isn't about punishment or distance. It's about preservation, about the space you create between yourself and the people who no longer see you clearly, no longer speak your name with reverence or warmth. I didn't announce it. I didn't slam a door, delete a number, or make any kind of scene. I simply stopped offering my voice where it was no longer heard. I didn't return calls, not right away. Not anymore. I didn't text back immediately with cheerful emojis. I didn't ask how their week had gone or remind them that Lily needed a jacket for the colder weather. I let them live in their world, uninterrupted by the soft interruptions I had once offered, reminders, support, questions that were really just quiet expressions of love. Instead, I began paying attention to my own world again. It started with something small, a cup of coffee at the kitchen table without the phone nearby. I stopped scrolling through photos of the past. I stopped checking Rachel's social media to see if they'd posted new family pictures that didn't include me. I stopped looking for mentions of me that never came. I picked up my old journal, one with the spine coming apart, and wrote a single sentence: "They took the house, but not the woman who built it." Then I closed it. That was enough for that day. In the mornings, I took longer showers, not rushed. Not timed around someone else's schedule, I let the steam fill. The mirror, I lingered. And for the first time in years, I let my mind wander somewhere that didn't involve grocery lists, upcoming birthdays, or wondering if Michael remembered to book the baby's shots. I cooked only for myself, not to impress or prepare or package. Just food I liked, quiet meals, a bowl of warm lentils, fresh basil over tomatoes, toast with real butter and too much jam. I played the radio in the kitchen again, classical, mostly, with no commercials and no chatter, just notes that felt like breathing, one afternoon. I sat on the front porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and watched the sky move. It was nothing, really, clouds shifting, a bird hopping near the steps, but I hadn't done that in years. Just sat, just watched, just existed without preparing for someone else's arrival. A few days later, I went to the library and renewed. My card, the woman behind the desk smiled, asked if I was looking for anything in particular. I told her, no, just something quiet. I came home with 3 novels and a small sense of return, like someone opening the window in a long-closed room. I called a lawyer, not for confrontation. Just for understanding, a calm, steady woman, with silver hair and a voice like a lullaby sat across from me and explained what my rights were, what the papers I'd signed had allowed. She never made me feel foolish, just informed. She let me sit in silence when the words became too much. At the end, she looked at me and said, "You're not powerless. Don't let them make you feel like you are." I thanked her and left with a folder tucked under my arm. I didn't open it for 2 days. But knowing it was there felt like a candle left lit in a dark corner, and in all that quiet, I began to gather the things I had set down over the years, not physical things, though there were those too, but parts of myself. I pulled out the watercolor set from the back of the hall closet. The brush tips were stiff, but the paint still opened like old friends. I taped paper to the table and let color run wild across the page. Not good, not polished, but mine. I began to walk again, just a few blocks each evening, past the bakery that still smelled like almond cake, past the old elm tree whose roots had lifted the pavement near the corner. I waved to the mailman, stopped to listen to the wind in the leaves. I came home with cheeks pink from the cold and something else, a flicker of steadiness returning. Rachel sent a message one morning. Just a line, "Can you watch Lily this weekend?" No greeting, no apology, no acknowledgement of anything. I didn't reply. It wasn't to hurt her. I just wasn't ready to return to a version of myself that no longer fit. The one who said yes out of habit, who showed up without being seen, who smiled through being sidelined. Michael called a few days later. I let it ring. Then again, later that week, he left a voicemail. His voice was casual, distant, like he was trying not to acknowledge the weight of what had happened, just checking in. "Mom, hope everything's okay, call when you can." I didn't, not because I was angry, but because I needed to see who I was when I stopped performing for them, when I stopped shaping myself to their expectations, when I just was. Silence became my way of breathing again. It wasn't easy. There were nights the stillness felt heavy, times I almost picked up the phone, times I almost told them, "You hurt me." But I'd done that before, with my presence, with my patience, with every small act of devotion that had been met with indifference. Now I was learning a new language. One made of boundary, of breath, of stillness. I don't know if they noticed, if they wondered why the messages stopped, if they scrolled through their calendars and thought, "We haven't heard from her in a while." I don't know if they told themselves I was just being difficult, or if they assumed I'd come around like I always had. But I wasn't who I was before, and in the absence of noise, I began to hear something else. My own voice, weak at first, unsure, then steadier, not speaking to them, Just to me, I made a list one day of things I used to love: lavender lotion, worn paperbacks, the sound of rain on the sunroom roof, soft cardigans, quiet jazz, afternoon naps. None of those things had been in my life for a long time. Now they returned, one by one, and with each one, I remembered, I am still here, still whole, still more than what was taken from me. Still mine. When you finally go quiet, not out of pain, but out of clarity, the world doesn't shout you back into its arms, it just gets quieter, too. But inside that quiet, something begins, a flicker. A private kind of strength, and once you feel it, you start to move differently, not louder, not harder, just inward, on your own terms. I didn't wake up one day and reinvent myself. I didn't cut my hair or book a trip to Italy or join a yoga class. I simply started reclaiming what had always belonged to me, but had gone unnoticed for far too long: my time, my peace, my presence. I began with the small things, the morning rituals I had let go of while always being available to others. I bought a little electric kettle, just for one, and a ceramic mug with a bluebird on the handle. I made a ritual of tea again, steeping leaves slowly, listening to the sound of the water bubbling in that quiet, steady way. I sat on the porch while it brewed, no noise, no schedule. Just the scent of early sun and the comfort of solitude. There's something sacred about not needing to be anywhere, about belonging only to the moment you're in. I started walking more regularly, not the polite strolls I used to take when killing time before a visit, but real walks, intentional ones. I found a park 5 blocks from my house that I had never bothered to visit. It had a little wooden bridge that arched over a pond, and some mornings I'd sit on the edge and watch the ducks skim the water like they knew something I didn't. Once, I ran into an older woman sitting on the next bench. She nodded at me and said, "You've got the eyes of someone who's learning how to breathe again." I smiled quietly and held that line close. She didn't ask questions, just sat beside me as the wind moved through the reeds. I started wearing colours again, not bright, not garish, just something other than the soft greys and taupes I had defaulted to when I wanted to stay invisible. A forest green sweater one day. A brooch with a tiny amber stone I hadn't worn in years. Not because I wanted to be seen, but because I wanted to remember that I could still choose beauty, even if no one else noticed. The house, too, began to shift, slowly, gently. I moved the couch just a few feet to let the light fall differently in the afternoons. I packed away the framed pictures that felt like echoes of something that didn't belong to me anymore. Instead, I put up small watercolors, ones I'd painted myself, and pressed dried leaves into frames. I cleared out the cupboard near the hallway and found stacks of old receipts and instruction manuals for appliances I no longer owned. I threw them out. It felt like exhaling something stale. Then I placed a woven basket on the shelf and began filling it with things that made me smile: a pinnacone from a walk, a scarf I'd wear upon years ago, a note from a neighbour thanking me for feeding her cat during her hospital stay. The house didn't feel like theirs anymore. It felt like mine again. Not because my name had magically reappeared on a document, but because I had stopped living like a guest inside it. One morning, I went to the community centre. They had a bulletin board by the entrance, flyers for bridge games, book clubs, watercolour classes. My fingers hovered over the watercolour. One for a while, Thursdays at 10 a.m, it said. Supplies provided, no experience necessary. I signed up. The first time I walked in, I felt like a stranger. The room was full of women my age, some older, chatting in low voices. But the instructor, a man with kind eyes and a quiet way of speaking, handed me a small tray of paints and said, "Just start with a colour you like." That's all, no performance, no expectations. I started with blue, soft, like sky at dusk. Week by week, my movements changed, not in dramatic ways, but people began to notice. The woman at the grocery store asked if I'd been on vacation. "You seem rested," she said. A neighbor waved from her porch and invited me for coffee. I went. We talked about the creeping ivy on our fences and the way the price of bread had climbed again. Nothing heavy, but something in me started to trust the sound of my own laughter again, and with each of those small steps, I began to move more purposefully in a direction I didn't need to name. I didn't need to be anyone's mother in those moments. I didn't need to fix or provide or carry. I just needed to be a woman who had weathered something quietly and had not vanished. I opened the folder the lawyer had given me and started reading more closely. There were options. There were protections I hadn't known about, things I could do to make sure that if I ever left this house, truly left it, it would be on my terms. I met with her again, brought my reading glasses this time, a notepad. We talked about clauses and conditions, about setting boundaries in legal ink. She explained everything with a gentleness I hadn't expected, and when I left, I felt taller, not proud, not powerful, just sure. Sure that I wouldn't let myself be erased again. I didn't tell Michael, not because I wanted to hide it, but because it wasn't for him, it was for me. For the woman who had spent decades caring without condition and had finally decided. That care didn't have to cost her everything. One night, as I watered the garden, I noticed a small green shoot pushing up through the soil near the edge of the fence. I hadn't planted anything there in years. I knelt down, touched the fragile stem with 2 fingers. It was a volunteer bloom. Unexpected, unplanned, a little burst of life insisting on a place, and I thought, maybe that's what I was now, not blooming for anyone, just blooming, still. I moved differently after that, in conversation, in posture, in thought, not hardened, just aware, and in that awareness, I felt something return. Not the life I had before, but something sturdier, something quieter, something mine. It's a strange thing, watching your absence make its way into someone else's life at first. It doesn't register. People are so used to you being there, hovering in the background, smoothing edges, fixing things before they fray, that they don't notice when you stop. The silence feels like a pause, not a conclusion, but then something slips. Something forgotten, something undone. And slowly, they start to feel the shape of the space you once filled. I didn't leave them in the traditional sense. I didn't move across the country or write a final letter. I didn't change my number. I just stepped back far enough that my voice no longer carried into their world. And from that distance, I began to see the ripple of it. It started with small things. A message from Rachel, short and clipped. "Can you remind me what medicine Lily takes when she's teething?" I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the irony settle. I had been the one keeping track for years, the little notebook. In my kitchen drawer held every dosage, every allergic reaction, every remedy that had ever worked. But they never asked until now. They assumed I'd always offer it freely, even when they'd stopped listening. I didn't respond. Then another message. A week later, "Is the pediatrician's number still the same?" I didn't reply to that one either. Not to be cruel, I simply didn't feel the urgency to be their safety net anymore. They had chosen distance. Now they were learning what that truly meant. I heard from a neighbor, the kind who sees everything but rarely says much, that Michael had come by the house on a Tuesday afternoon. I hadn't been home. He'd knocked, waited, then walked around the back like he used to when he was a boy. He didn't leave a note, just lingered, then left. I wondered what he had wanted. More than that, I wondered why he thought he could show up like nothing had shifted, as if my silence was a phase, as if I was merely cooling off, waiting to be coaxed back with a half-hearted smile or a lukewarm apology. but I was past waiting. From what I could gather, things were unraveling. In quiet, inconvenient ways. Rachel had called the community centre one Thursday, the same one where I'd started taking watercolour class, to ask if I could pick Lily up from a tumbling group she'd joined. The receptionist told her politely that I wasn't on the pick-up list, that I hadn't volunteered. They hadn't expected that. For years I had said yes before they even asked. Now they were learning what a no sounded like, or worse for them, what it felt like when there wasn't an answer at all. Another neighbour, a kind woman named Denise, who walks her dog at sunset, stopped me one evening I saw Michael at the pharmacy the other day. She said gently, "He looked tired." I didn't ask why, I just nodded. People think the weight of a family falls loud, with fights, with slammed doors, with bitter farewells. But more often, it's quieter. It falls through routines, through the everyday things you no longer do for each other. The groceries they forgot I always stocked in their pantry. The birthday cards that no longer arrived in the mailbox. The soup that didn't show up when they were sick. All those invisible strings. They only notice them once they've snapped. It wasn't revenge. I didn't sit by the window, gloating over their struggles. I didn't feel proud that they were finally fumbling. If anything, it saddened me to see how fragile their world was without the scaffolding I had silently provided. But it also clarified something I'd refused to see for years. My love had become expected, not appreciated. My presence had become a convenience, not a connection. And now that it was gone, they had to reckon with what they'd dismissed. One evening, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, the television off, a blanket over my knees. I watched the flames rise and fall, shadows dancing across the hardwood floor, and thought of how often I had been the one to remember, to follow up, to carry, to forgive, to initiate. They hadn't noticed until they had to remember on their own. It was a sobering kind of justice, not sweet, not triumphant, just true. Rachel sent a longer message that month, a shift in tone. "Hi, I know things have felt off lately. We've just been overwhelmed. If you're open to it, I'd love to talk." I read it twice, then closed my phone. I wasn't angry. I was just no longer responsible for patching the places they refused to tend. Letting go isn't a grand gesture. It's a collection of moments where you choose peace over pattern, where you decide not to chase someone who let the leash go long ago. I let myself cry that night, not out of grief, but out of release. Because somewhere deep down, I had been holding onto the hope that they'd wake up one day and realize what I had meant to their lives, that they'd reach for me with real words, not requests. That they'd come not because they needed me, but because they missed me. But I was tired of waiting for that day. And yet, even from where I stood, removed, quiet, unseen, I knew something was shifting for them too. The weight of what they'd lost wasn't dramatic, but it was real. It echoed in the missed pickups, the forgotten appointments, the empty chairs I used to fill without being asked. And in that echo, I felt not victory, but validation. They had expected me to stay available. They hadn't expected me to heal. But healing makes you move differently. It makes you hold your value in your own hands, instead of placing it in theirs. And once you do that, you stop accepting half-love from people who only remember your worth when it costs them something. They were learning, now, what life looked like without me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let them. I hadn't planned to write anything. It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky folds into itself and every corner of the house seems to hush. I was sorting through a drawer in the study, mostly out of boredom. Old receipts, expired coupons, a handful of dried pens. But tucked in the back was a bundle of blank stationery, ivory paper with a faint gold border, the kind I used to save for birthday notes or thank you letters. I hadn't touched it in years. I stood there for a long moment, then took one sheet and carried it to the kitchen table. I sat, no intention, no script. Just that low drum of rain on the window pane and the soft scratch of my pen against the paper. My hands moved before my thoughts fully formed. At the top, I wrote to the woman I used to be, and then I paused, because that line, that simple, almost theatrical phrase, cracked something open. Not pain, not grief, just recognition, the kind that settles into you like a truth long overdue. I didn't write to Michael, I didn't write to Rachel, I didn't even write to Lily, though the ache of her absence lingered every time I passed the shelf where her picture once sat. I wrote to myself, to the version of me who had waited by the phone, who had baked pies that were never tasted, who had folded baby clothes with trembling hands and packed casseroles with silent hope, the woman who had tried, endlessly, to be enough. I wrote slowly, carefully. You gave so much, I began. You offered pieces of yourself like sugar cubes in tea, melting into their lives without being asked. You became the warmth in rooms where no one noticed the cold until you stopped showing up. I remembered the first time I had let Michael cry into my shoulder as a child, his small fingers clutching my blouse, his sobs sticky with fever and fear. I had held him through the night, whispering stories into his ear. I didn't write about that to shame him. I wrote it to honor the woman who held him, who held everything without ever asking to be held in return. You forgot yourself in the process. I wrote, not all at once, but piece by piece, until you didn't recognize the silence. As a wound, you mistook it for peace. I set the pen down for a while. The ink had begun to pool where my grip trembled. I took a deep breath and stood at the window. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the garden below looked softened, not sad, just hushed. That was how I felt now, softened, hushed, but whole when I returned to the letter. I wrote the words I never knew I needed. I forgive you, and then, quietly, I see you. I thought back to the holidays when I had waited for someone to ask what I wanted, and no one ever did, to the Mother's Days where my gift was an afterthought, a candle with no card, a text sent hours late, to the surgeries I faced alone, the celebrations I wasn't invited to, the conversations where I was present but invisible. You survived it, I wrote, and now you're not surviving, you're becoming. I folded the letter carefully. I didn't seal it. I placed it in a small wooden box, the one that used to hold Michael's baby teeth. Years ago, the irony made me smile, not bitter, just full circle. The next morning, I placed the box on my bedside table, not to reread the letter every day, but to remind myself that I had spoken, that I had honored the part of me no one else had remembered to thank. Later that week, I bought a new journal, not for tracking groceries or appointments, but just for me. On the first page, I copied a single line from the letter. Your silence was not emptiness. It was an opening. I carried that line with me as I moved through the days, in the grocery store, when I picked out apples without wondering what Lily would like, at the post office, when I no longer searched for stamps to send birthday cards they wouldn't acknowledge, in the stillness of the evenings, when I sat on the porch with my cup of tea and let the dusk arrive without apology. The letter didn't change what happened. It didn't bring them back. It didn't undo the wound of that moment in the garden when Michael said I wasn't real family, but it changed me, because I had finally spoken the truth out loud. To the only person who had truly listened all along, myself. That letter reminded me that love given freely still has value, even when it isn't returned. That I didn't need validation to know I had shown up, that my worth wasn't in what I could do for others, but in the fact that I kept choosing love even in the face of silence. It reminded me that healing is slow, not linear, that some days I'd miss them with an ache so quiet it startled me, that I'd still flinch when a child with curls passed by in a shopping cart and reminded me of Lily's laugh, that I'd still wonder if Michael ever paused in his day and thought of me. But that wondering didn't control me anymore. I had mourned the story I thought we were writing together. I had closed that chapter, not with anger, not with fury, but with a pen and a letter, and the gentleness I had always given them finally turned inward. That letter sits beside me now, not a plea, not a protest, just a truth, and every time I pass it, I remember who I am, not a guest in their lives, not a forgotten mother, but a woman who gave love, found silence, and learned to speak again, not louder, but deeper, and that I've come to learn is more than enough. These days the house wakes slowly. I open the curtains a little after 7, never in a hurry. Letting the light seep in like something earned, it pools across the floor, onto the worn rug, climbs the legs of the table I bought second-hand nearly 20 years ago. Dust glints in the morning sun, and I no longer rush to wipe it away. Some things are allowed to settle. I make tea in my bluebird mug and sit near the window in the living room, where the light is softest. The street outside is quiet, the occasional bark of a dog, the hum of a neighbour's car starting, a bicycle bell in the distance. It doesn't sound like the life I used to have, but it feels like the one I needed all along. No one calls much anymore. I don't mind. There's a peace in not being needed, a kind of stillness that only arrives once you've stopped trying to be essential in someone else's story. I write in my journal most mornings now. Sometimes just a line or two, a thought, a scent, a memory that rises up like steam from a cup. I've found that the more I write, the less I need to speak. Not because I don't have anything to say, but because the audience I was once chasing has grown so distant, I've stopped calling their names into the wind. I walk nearly every day, even when it's cold. I've come to know the cracks in the pavement, the soft rustle of the elm branches when they sway against one another, the cat who sits in Mrs. Lowry's window like a sentinel. I smile at people. Some smile back, others don't. Either way, I carry on. I visit the library once a week. I return my books early. I browse slowly, deliberately, as if each cover holds a secret waiting just for me. I don't ask for recommendations anymore. I trust my own hands. They've carried enough to know what they need. Sometimes I pass mothers pushing strollers or guiding toddlers across intersections. I don't linger on their faces. I don't search for familiarity. That was a habit I had to break, looking for my granddaughter in the shape of every small child, waiting to be reminded of what I lost. Now I let those children pass like weather, sweet, temporary, untouchable. The watercolor class continues. On Thursdays, we laugh often, all of us women who've lived through enough to know when laughter is sacred. I've made friends there, not fast ones, not loud, but kind. They bring me cuttings from their gardens, little jars of jam, a scarf, someone wear upon on a whim. I bring them silence when they need it, and tea when the room feels too cold. We don't talk much about our families. There's a silent agreement. We share who we are now, not who we used to be. I've started tending my garden again, really tending it, not just watering. Not just pulling weeds. I've added new flowers. Marigolds, aster, lavender for the bees. I talk to them sometimes, in that quiet way you do when your voice needs somewhere to go. And they bloom, not for anyone else. Just for me. Michael hasn't come by again. There was a message from him a few weeks ago. I listened to it once. Hey, Mom, just wondering how you are. That was all. No apology, no acknowledgement. But it didn't hurt the way I thought it might. It didn't feel like a thread I needed to tug at. It felt like a leaf falling late in the season, not unwelcome, but no longer important to the branch it left behind. I didn't return the call. There's no bitterness in that choice, just clarity. Sometimes love is letting someone go, not in anger, but in acceptance, letting them live with the choices they made. letting them find the echo of your absence on their own, because I'm not gone, I'm just no longer standing where they stopped looking. I've come to understand that silence isn't emptiness. It's space, for breath, for healing, for becoming someone whole again. My life is quiet now. No more early morning texts asking for last-minute favors. No more arranging birthday parties I'm not invited to. No more grocery lists that don't include me. No more waiting to be remembered. And yet, in all that absence, I've found presence. I'm present in my mornings, in the whistle of the kettle, in the pull of soft socks over my heels, in the taste of toast I make just the way I like it, to crisp, a bit too much marmalade. I'm present in my evenings, in the turning pages of a book, in the flicker of candlelight against the window, in the way I tuck myself into bed, not with loneliness, but with a kind of contentment that feels earned. There are days that still ache. Of course, moments when I wonder what might have been if they had seen me, truly seen me, when I was standing right in front of them, if they had reached for my hand before I put it away. If they had understood that love doesn't stay where it isn't, welcomed, but those moments pass, like clouds, like wind, and in their place, something steadier remains. A life that is mine, a voice that doesn't need an audience, a home that holds me, even if the deed never will again. I don't need a seat at their table. I've set my own, not grand, not loud, but honest, and every day I fill it with the kind of love that doesn't ask to be seen, only felt. I wasn't angry, I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. It happened on a Sunday, late morning. The sky was clean and clear in that soft way it sometimes is after rain, and I had just come back from the corner market with a small bag of pears and a bunch of tulips, yellow. I don't know why I picked yellow, they just looked like the kind that didn't need anything but sunlight and a vase to do their job. I remember placing them gently into the chipped pitcher I use for flowers. The one that's cracked near the handle but still holds water, when I saw a shadow through the front window. A familiar shape. He was standing on the porch, Michael, older, slightly heavier than the last time I saw him, but unmistakably my son. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking unsure. As if he didn't quite remember how to knock, I watched him for a second from behind the curtain, not hiding, just observing. He looked like a man who had finally found the courage to come back, only to realize he had no idea what door he was walking through. I opened it before he could lift his hand. We stood there, quiet. The spring breeze moved between us like a third presence. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let him feel it, let him carry it a little. I was in the neighborhood, he said. It was the same tone he used when he was 15 and came home an hour past. Curfew, I figured, I replied. He looked older, not just in the face, in the posture, in the way he kept glancing down, like the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. I wanted to see how you were doing. I'm doing just fine, I said, and I meant it. Another pause. He looked past me, into the house, like he was searching for something. Familiarity, maybe, comfort, maybe even permission. It looks different, he said. I nodded. It feels different. He didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite him. We just stood there, two people on the edge of something they couldn't name. A mother and a son with miles between them, none of them measured in distance. I've been meaning to call, he said quietly. I know. He looked up then, properly. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw what I hadn't seen in years. Not expectation, not distance, but recognition, a flicker of the boy I used to know, the one who cried into my coat on his first day of school, the one who once wrote me a card that said, "Mom, I love you more than Saturn's rings." I think I got lost, he said, voice cracking just enough to make him pause. Somewhere along the way, I nodded again, not out of agreement, out of understanding. We stood like that for a moment longer, to people who had both lived through silence, who had both changed in the space it carved. I don't expect anything, he said after a while. I wanted you to know I'm sorry. For the house, for the party, for all of it. The wind lifted a strand of hair from my face. I didn't reach to brush it away. I appreciate that, I said, and I did. He looked down again. Lily asks about you sometimes. That name landed soft and sharp at once. Like a feather brushing the edge of an old bruise, she should. I said, gentler than I intended. She deserves to know who's in her story. He looked up again, tears somewhere in the back of his eyes, though none came. I'd like to bring her sometime. If it's okay, I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang there, real and raw. I'll think about it, I said finally, and I meant that too. He nodded. There was no hug. No dramatic reconciliation. Just a quiet man walking back down the steps, into a life he was still figuring out how to live differently. I closed the door and returned to my tulips. The light had shifted slightly, warmer now. The room felt the same, and yet it didn't. I stood for a moment, letting the silence return. Not the silence of pain, the silence of peace. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe he'd call again, maybe he wouldn't. Maybe Lily would show up on my porch with a picture she drew. Maybe I'd still spend most of my days alone, but the difference was, now I knew I was not waiting. I had built something here, in this quiet life, something slow and whole and real, something that didn't vanish when someone else left the room. I went to the garden that afternoon and trimmed back the herbs. Lavender, rosemary, sage, their scent clung to my hands, strong and grounding. I pressed my palms to the soil, letting the earth remind me that roots don't need noise to grow, they just need space. Patience and time as the sun dipped low. I made dinner for one. I lit a candle, because I wanted to, not because anyone was coming. I placed the letter I'd written, still folded neatly in its box, on the table beside me, and I whispered, not to anyone in particular, just to the air, I am still here, not bitter, not waiting. Just whole, and as the wind moved through the garden, as the house exhaled with the dusk, I knew quiet was never a punishment, it was my return.